Hello, my dear friends, and welcome. I'm Mari Thurger, and today I'm here to answer another recurrent question, but also to try to clarify a very recurrent doubt in relation to the Eddas, if they are or not sacred texts, and if they can be considered as such. I think this is a very common impulse, especially from the part of people who come from certain Abrahamic religious backgrounds where there are several sacred texts, clear dogmatic theologies, quite specific religious canons. And so when people try to shift from such religious backgrounds into paganism, especially when it comes to more animistic modes of belief systems, well, many people are at a loss without a guiding corpus of religious texts. And in my personal opinion, when people still feel the need to follow or hold on to a body of religious conceptions as guiding paths to a spirituality, well, they are probably not yet ready to deal with paganism, especially not yet ready to reflect upon an animistic worldview. Dogma and religious control has been quite a strong societal pattern in Western societies, and it is understandable why it is so hard for some people to let go of that. And what often happens is more of a paganization of Abrahamic systems of belief rather than shifting into an animistic perception. And then you find things like this meme, and I quote, which I have actually memorized, unfortunately. "Never pick a fight with those who believe in Odin. They will gladly die to see him, and they will happily take you out with them." This right there is religious extremism, martyrdom, fanaticism, these very unhealthy patterns of oppressive religious systems brought into paganism, which is nothing more than changing terms of Abrahamic conceptions for pagan terms, and just change the name in that meme to God, and you are ready to go on another crusade against the infidels, and change it to Allah, and you got yourself Islamic religious extremism. Whoever made this meme is clearly, well, I was going to say fucking stupid, but I don't want to offend anyone, so I'm going to say it is clearly someone who has not yet had the mental capacity to understand the basic conceptions of a pagan mindset, let alone the ability to have critical thought when it comes to the study of pre-Christian religions and belief systems. And that's sad. And as a pagan myself, it's hard to be impartial when it comes to absolute shite like this. Anyway, moving on. The Eddas are not religious texts, and I shall explain it why, quite briefly. But this is not to state that there aren't religious understandings within ancient pre-Abrahamic texts of a pagan nature, because there are, and several have survived, not as many as we would like, but some. When it comes to Old Norse written sources, it's a bit tricky to understand the religious content, as much of these literary sources were composed in Iceland, mainly within Christian context, and there's a very consolidated body of literature that is clearly the product of religious syncretism, where the pagan mixes very well with the Christian, and it's quite hard to discern which is which. But of course, I've said it here before, the poem Havamal, for instance, from stanzas 138 to 146, which tells us of Odin's sacrifice to obtain knowledge, or the knowledge of the runes. It does show us a religious understanding, and this rather short part can be taken as a religious text because it shows experimental engagement to obtain otherworldly mysteries as a reward that allows the improvement of one's day-to-day reality. A religious understanding of the rituals of a given spiritual practice that aims to achieve transcendent matters. This, of course, is debatable, can be debatable. As another example, there is, of course, the poem Solariot, which I like it a lot, written in Iceland around the 13th century, 200 years after Christianity became the official religion of Iceland. In this poem, the Song of the Sun, we clearly see a religious intention towards the sun as a symbolic element of a religious and spiritual nature. In this poem, the Christian and the pagan is, again, very well mixed, and it's hard to understand to what extent we are dealing with a Christian or a pagan religious theme. Probably both, obviously. But in this particular case, it is less hard to understand the pagan religious content because the sun was an important religious element in Scandinavia, at least since the Scandinavian Bronze Age, where we see in the archaeological record sun symbols and clear iconographic solar representations that indicates the importance of the sun as a Scandinavian pre-Christian religious element. Mostly we are dealing with symbolic contexts pre-swastika, before the swastika symbol was introduced in Scandinavia, when Scandinavians still used a circle with a cross, the sun wheel, as a religious symbolism for the sun, until, of course, around more or less the 4th century of the Common Era, by Roman influence, the swastika is introduced in Scandinavian context as a solar symbol, and replaces the sun wheel, thus leading to new iconographic representations of the sun throughout the Scandinavian Iron Age. And the swastika symbol is presented in context of the religious background of the elite, and with Christianization in Scandinavia, the swastika maintains somewhat its connotations with the sun, but it also becomes a symbol of Christ, as Christ in the Bible was already understood as a solar deity or connected to the sun. So there's this clever religious syncretism, and then we end up seeing rune stones and memorial stones in which the swastika is inserted in new religious iconography, that of the Christian cross. So the poem Solariod reflects upon both these pagan and Christian religious conceptions towards the sun, but very well mixed together. But just because certain texts contain a religious conception or express a certain ritualization that aims to achieve a transcendent matter, it doesn't make these sources religious texts per se, because there's no dogma, no religious canons, there isn't a clear religious conduct to be followed by an organism that establishes the institutionalization of a religious belief. These texts can be used, of course, to understand certain religious conceptions or predisposition to focus on religiosity, but they are not religious texts. Not sure if you can hear it, but one of my cats is trying to get in. It's Sol, but she cannot enter right now while I'm trying to focus on this. Sorry. Anyway, so concerning the Edda, can the Edda be considered a sacred and or religious book? Many people nowadays take both Eddas, but especially the Poetic Edda, as a kind of holy book or Bible for the ancient Vikings. And even in academia, this misconception is very common, mind you, as when someone sometimes claims that the Eddas would be a set of texts that can be considered sacred books for the Nordic religion, being known as the Eddas. And such a statement really does not help in understanding such sources, or some esoteric sources and much more popular esoteric works that claim that the Edda can be considered as the Germanic Bible. But what was the Poetic Edda anyway? Why should we have a critical attitude towards it as an historical document? Well, the Poetic Edda comes essentially from a medieval codex, JKS 23654TO, being a collection of several manuscripts assembled by an anonymous compiler. Although many poems have the possibility of having been composed in the end of the Viking Age, or rather at the culmination of the Scandinavian Iron Age, sources such as the Voluspo and the Ovomol probably written in or compiled in the 10th century Iceland. Others are considered late, quite late, composed in the Christian Middle Ages, such as Hrimskvida. Therefore, there are differences between form and content in these poems. The concept of the Edda is therefore that of a medieval book, there being nothing similar for pre-Christian Norse era. So, how to read and research the mythological themes in this primary source? Well, the researcher, or the researchers, must have in mind that it is a source that has gone through numerous content filters, from patriarchal and religious ideas of a pre-Christian elite to Christian ideologies themselves, right? The poems also underwent form filtering from alliteration, literary structures, and to aesthetic arrangements. Comparisons with literary material from Iceland and medieval Europe must also be taken into consideration when studying these sources. Comparative studies are necessary with sources from the Viking Age itself, runic inscriptions, memorial stones, iconographic elements, and foreign sources, Arabic, Saxon, and Latin chronicles. Well, these are the basic elements that we must take in mind in order to study these literary materials, right? And the researcher or the researchers should also make use of an updated secondary bibliography, which will allow the elaboration of good conceptual questions and problematizations for the research. Esoteric authors should be avoided if really the focus is historical scientific for a better understanding of the social and human sciences, of course. Such esoteric sources which lead to treating the Poetic Edda as a theology along the lines of the Bible. We have the example of the Nordic pantheon itself, which is a medieval construction, quite systematized according to the medieval Christian religious doctrine, in an attempt to structure a pantheon that follows religious standards and concepts through a medieval Christian lens. And the Norse pantheon is not, in fact, a pre-Christian truth, as the reality of pre-Christian Nordic animist belief systems, especially from the perspective of archaeology that deals with the material culture of that period, indicates a complexity of local and regional realities that did not follow a defined standard in relation to the concept of the divine, but rather a greater multiplicity of concepts and belief systems that are much more varied and subject to customization for each social reality. It is important to synchronize these studies with a more focused understanding of the universe of pagan beliefs as a plural dynamic system of beliefs and its role in a political elite in the preservation of certain religious contents. And to finalize this video, I also take the opportunity to give answer to another question and a recurrent idea, which is about the Prose Edda, which is often seen as a saga. And there's clearly a certain confusion in relation to both the content of Snorre's Prose Edda as well as a rather misapplication of some terms, especially the term saga. Snorre's Edda, the Prose Edda, is not a religious text, but it is not a saga either. This question is recurrent in the sense that many people think that Snorre's Edda would have been a set of sagas. Even some YouTubers, quite well-known YouTubers actually, have been making these statements. And I think it is important to clarify that sagas and Eddas are not the same thing, although many people say that they are because there seems there seems to be some confusion between both clearly, which is really understandable, right? The term Edda was only found in one of the manuscripts of the Prose Edda by Snorre Sturluson, which was a handbook on Norse myths written for professional poets. Over time, the word Eddic came to mean any type of poem with mythological content, such as the most famous codex gathering this type of material, the basis for the modern Poetic Edda, whose main source is the Codex Regius. Thus, nowadays we call the Edda both the prosaic manual written by Snorre, the Prose Edda, and the anonymous collection of poems, the Poetic Edda. Both are called Eddas, right? Icelandic sagas are another type of literary material. They constitute a vast corpus of written sources with several variations, but having a similar pattern. They are generally written in prose, with some poetic inclusions, recounting the trajectory of a protagonist within a genealogical structure. Sagas can be compared to epics and romances from other areas, but they are a material proper to the medieval Icelandic context. Despite today's widespread use of the term saga for any type of epic action, its use for any literary form from the medieval Scandinavian area is an error. Thus, although some sagas also contain mythological material, the Edda Minora, the Lesser Edda, which are poems of Eddic type from the Fornara Sogur and other prose works not included in Codex Regius, is a different literary work. And even if Snorre wrote some Icelandic sagas, tradition has it, they are different materials that do not come together. So, I do hope this video was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends. Woo! Do. Oh, Mr. Sandman, meow meow meow. Meow meow meow. Meow 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 meow. Yes. Wait. Yes, that is correct. You are absolutely right.